Hello everybody, good afternoon. My name is Liz Moseley. I'm one of the editors and partners here at Tortoise, and you're very welcome to this lunchtime's digital thinking about you and your boss and your mental health. Something that we've all been thinking more about since the world changed on the 23rd of March here in the UK and other dates around the world if you're overseas. It's a conversation that I'm particularly interested in from a personal perspective, but I will attempt not to use the hour as a therapy session for me, but we'll try to open out and get as many personal perspectives and experiences, positive and negative, as we can, as we try to explore not only what is required, but what is reasonable to expect in terms of support and help from your employer if you are employed, and what support you can give if you are a manager or leader of people who are working in these extraordinary times. And I think there's a lot to get through. My colleague Tessa Murray is in the chat, so if you would like to make a contribution, as we always say in ThinkIn, we try to avoid questions. We'd rather have points of view and real experiences than a question, because it's not a panel discussion as such. Then by all means, type away with Tessa in the chat. She does say that she's not very good at typing, but she's certainly very good at talking, so we'll see how that goes. And if you would like to come on screen, then by all means put your little blue digital hand up. If you go to the participants button, you should see a little blue hand that you can raise if you'd like me to come to you during the course of the discussion. I'm very pleased to be joined by two people who have bona fide expertise in this area. Dr. Richard Heron is the Vice President of Health and the Chief Medical Officer at BP, and Faye McGuinness is the Head of Workplace Wellbeing Project at the mental health charity Mind. And I'm going to start, if I can, I'll come to Faye and Richard in a second. I'm going to start, if I can, to test if you are listening to me about how to use your little blue hand, and we'll just get a quick show of hands, as we often do in ThinkIns in the physical world as well as the virtual one. On a couple of questions, just because I'm interested to know how people are finding it in general. If you are somebody who is working at the moment, who is either self-employed or employed or whatever, whether you're on furlough or whether you're working at home or whatever your working scenario is, I'd like you to put your digital blue hand up, please, if since the start of lockdown, your employer has put in place some specific or additional tools or sessions or guidelines or anything in relation to helping you to manage your mental health during this time. If since the beginning of lockdown your employer has done something extra about mental health, put your little digital blue hand up. Wow, that's a lot. Not quite a majority, but there's certainly lots and lots of people have experienced attempts by their employers to do additional support and what have you. I'd love to come to some of you to hear about what those things are. Okay, hands down, hands down. Another question. I would like to know if at the moment you felt you needed to talk to your boss or your employer in some way about your own mental health, about how you were coping. I'd like you to put your hand up, those of you who would feel comfortable to do that at the moment. Okay, yes. Oh, yes, good, lots. I'm going to scroll down. Okay, that's good. So it's a good, perhaps not quite half, but there's certainly a good proportion of people who say that they would feel comfortable to approach, which I think is an encouraging sign. Obviously, there are plenty of people who wouldn't at the moment feel that way, but maybe they wouldn't under any circumstances. Okay, so now I've kind of got a bit of a sense of where we're at. It's obviously not everybody is in the same boat, but if we can start with Richard, who looks after a huge number of people, and we've just been hearing, you've just come to this call, Richard, from a call with 10,000 people on it, a BP worldwide, so it's a large organisation of people for whose mental health is particularly of importance in your remit, but obviously under the direction of Bernard Looney, increasingly his as well. Could you have a go at this question for me, Richard, just to kick us off? What is required by law of an employer to look after and protect the mental well-being of its workforce? And then secondarily to that, what is reasonable for an employee to expect of their employer, perhaps over and above what is required as the baseline?
Okay, well, I think BP is a global organisation, so we've got 75,000 people roughly in 78 countries, and the regulations vary from country to country about what's required over what may be sort of recommended or what we think is important in BP as a company. But in general, there's a general duty of care, which I think extends through most countries that we would operate in. And we have always said that the minimum is actually meeting local regulations. Local regulations is a minimum wherever we operate. So that's a duty really that the employer understands the risks that work may bring to employees and manages those risks and controls, or where it can actually avoid those risks altogether. So if you can take a risk away, great. Or if you can manage a threat away, great. If you can't, minimize it. And that's really the same in the UK, where we then have the health and safety executive have identified, how do you actually identify risks associated with mental health at work? And in general, I think it comes into fairly simple bits and pieces. So you look at the demands on people, you look at the degree of control over the work that they have, and you look at the degree of support people have, and also the degree of change that may impact on people, and making sure that you have actually managed some of those. So I think that's a basic requirement. I think that you've also then got equality issues as well. So there's Equality Act, which is really around reasonable accommodation for people who may have a mental health problem, just as they might a physical issue as well. And I guess just to close that, I mean, I think that's where we really need to head, which is, we all have physical health, we all have mental health. We need to treat these two elements of our whole health very, very in a very, very balanced way. And traditionally that hasn't been the case, I think.
I suppose in this period of time when so many people's working reality changed, and I know obviously if you're a key worker, then perhaps the experience of your work will feel very different in the pandemic, but the physical work that you're doing, is sort of not dramatically different, as in if you leave your office and come and work at home is sort of a dramatic shift.
Yeah.
But let's think about those people, for example, who are working at home at the moment. Let's take that group of people for now. The benchmark to meeting those safeguards, to sort of meeting the requirement to protect the well-being as per the local guidelines that you said, that's changed. I mean, it changed overnight. So what are the sorts of things that BP, for example, have put in place to try and look after people at the moment?
Well, I like to sort of look at it through a slightly different lens, which is really that, and we know this from research that both we've carried out at BP and others have, which is when leaders genuinely care about the health and well-being of their staff, good things happen. You see good things in safety, you see good things in performance, you actually attract people to a company and you hold on to them, they stay with you. Now, why would an employer not want to do these things? I mean, that's the conversation I have with our leaders, both before and after COVID. I think what we're also helping people to realise is that, we talk about 1 in 4 people being affected by mental health in the past. We use figures like that, 1 in 4 or 1 in 6. But so we actually all have a kind of baseline of people whose mental health is troubled from some form. And we mustn't forget that. So that hasn't changed because of COVID. That was already there. So we should have plans in place for that. But this is really bringing it down to 1 in 1. It really sort of talking about everybody's affected. Everybody's affected. And it's either me, it's somebody I know, it's a friend, it's a colleague, it's a co-worker. So I think having that conversation within the organisation has really moved the ball really to say, look, if you really want to address how your company works, you have to recognise that mental health is a challenge for everybody. It's just different for all of them. Now, I think then when you come back to the COVID response particularly, it has changed massively for people overnight. But really, unless you listen to people to understand what those challenges are and how they've changed, we can't really presuppose we know the answers to how to respond. So one of the things, in fact, we were just talking about it before the call, is we have our CEO doing a weekly catch up with anyone who wants to join into this. So we use Microsoft Teams as it happens, but I just left his call to join this one. We have 10,000 people across BP. That's 10 out of 75,000. And of course, we're right around the world, so some people are asleep. And they're able to ask questions live. He talks about his mental health. He talks about how he's feeling. He talks about fatigue and how it's affecting him. And he's also talked about things like Headspace, the app that we brought in, very quickly as part of this, recognizing that people are troubled. They're fearful, they're uncertain, they're having trouble sleeping, and there are things that are there to help. How do we know it? We ask the question. So we actually asked the question about whether we're also surveying people all the time in a much more active way than we did before. We always did it, but a weekly survey of the population, doing a sort of sample, we're able to find out that people's sleep disruption has worsened since we last looked. That could be for many, many reasons. And a lot of it, I think, is around fear and uncertainty. And those things come from, very different places. There's fear of the disease. That's changed. Will I catch this? Will I die from it? What about my relatives? All of that sort of fear of the unknown there. And then there's fear about my job. Will I have a job when this gets back? How will I pay the bills? There's all of that kind of fear going with it. Will the company survive? So by asking the questions, we're actually getting a fantastic live feed really around what's concerning people. And then what that's allowed us to do is to create responses with business resource groups or employee, bottom up involvement too, to sort of put together what makes sense for people who are working from home, people who are trying to do education from home, people who are feeling isolated, family disruption. We talk about, the whole issue of family dynamics has changed. Some people are spending nowhere near enough time to get the energy they need with the people that they love. And that's distressing. Some people are spending too much time with people they don't really want to be with. And that's an issue too. So it's a very, very tricky dynamic to guess without listening and asking. And I think that's the first thing we've done a lot of listening, really, to try and get underneath that.
There's a couple of comments already coming in from parents, mums, Emma Casey and Elena in the chat. And we actually had 2 sessions with hundreds of people from across BP last week on parenting in particular, and the mental health impact on the parent, but also on the child or children as well, of everybody being cooped up, of there not being a sense of a sort of a planning scope. The next time we see Granny will be this day, and we don't know that now, and and there's a lot to unpack there. And guilt was a recurring word that came up a lot. One of my favourite moments from that session actually was when we came to a guy towards the end of one of the sessions, and it took him a while to turn his camera on. There was a bit of sort of clattering around and kerfuffling around it, and he sort of said, "Oh, I just look a bit dishevelled." I said, "Oh, don't worry, that's what it's like to be on a Zoom ThinkIn." And he was in bed with his 8-month-old daughter, who wasn't sleeping at all. And there's nothing like not sleeping to really make you look at the world through an unusual lens.
Absolutely. And I know we're just coming into Mental Health Week. It was going to be about sleep. It's now about kindness, but actually being kind to yourself is a good start. And we've sort of talked a bit about that, and helping people with sleep, switching off, creating breaks between one activity and another. And actually what we lost a lot of the sort of barriers that we used to navigate by. A commute to work was a kind of signal that we've left one part of our day, the family part, we've joined a working piece of the day, and then there's another prompt, which was going home, that allowed us to do that. So it's quite disorientating, I think, particularly for people with children, that the working parent's actually now in the house but not available. That doesn't make sense. How do I deal with that? And I think on the opposite side of it, with video calls, we've actually massively increased the number of connections that we've made with people, and it feels a little bit more intimate in a way. I'm seeing into everybody's home. I'm seeing their dogs. I'm seeing their kids quite a lot.
Yeah.
And then people are popping in and out in the background. So I was with one of my colleagues who's in Washington, D.C. yesterday, and her husband just pops around into the corner. And I said, "Oh, hi, Patrick, how are you?" I actually had dinner with them, probably 2 or 3 years back, and met her husband. And it was really quite nice, actually, to have a much more normal conversation with an employee as a family member, actually, and ask how Silas and the kids were.
I'm going to go to, if I can, Elena, who's put a comment in the chat about being a single parent with 2 young children. Elena, are you there?
Hi, yes.
Hi, Elena. Tell us a little bit about, you said that being at home with 2 young children and also trying to work has impacted your mental health. How are you doing? How are you coping?
Well, there are good days and bad days. But anyway, I'm using Headspace.
So Headspace is this app that helps. Is it a meditation thing, or what does it do?
Yes, it's meditation, mindfulness. I never tried anything like that before this, but I thought it was worth giving it a go. And some days I actually managed to get more into it. And others, it's more recording that it's playing, and I'm not really able to actually focus on that. But I'm trying to make a habit of it.
Sorry, how old are your kids?
6 and 4.
They're little, really little. Yeah, that is tough. I'm interested in this, the Headspace mindfulness thing. Obviously, we were knee deep quite early on in practical tips, things you must do, and the sort of wellness agenda. So if I can come to Faye McGuinness, who, as I said, heads up the workplace wellbeing project at Mind, a mental health charity. Hi, Faye.
Hi.
Tell us a bit about this wellness thing. And we had a brief conversation yesterday, Faye and I'm a bit torn on wellness, because as much as I sort of know that I must take a screen break and go for a walk and convene with nature and all of those practical things, and I know it would make a difference, there's a part of me that worries that it undermines a little bit, or is slightly reductive of just how tough this can be and how serious the problems can be that arise from it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to be here. I think I just want to start by saying what the situation was before COVID-19 in relation to workplace mental health, because I think it's really important to acknowledge that we were already facing quite a crisis in terms of mental health at work before COVID-19.
Yeah.
So what we know is that poor mental health at work was costing UK employers £45 billion a year, and they were the most recent stats from January carried out by Deloitte. And we know that £29 billion of that was due to presenteeism costs. So people being in the workplace, but either not being able to be as productive as they might be because they weren't feeling well, they weren't getting the right support, or actually spending too many hours in work, but those hours were not being productive.
Yeah.
So we already knew that we had a crisis before COVID-19. And I think for me, COVID-19 has really shone a light on some of those issues. So there are lots of things that people are struggling with, but I think it also provides a real opportunity for us to think about and understand those real drivers that are triggering poor mental health in the workplace. So I think there is some opportunity there. And I think I come back to Richard's point, which I think is really important. At Mind, we look at the 3-pronged approach. Okay, so we look at well-being for everybody. So employers have a responsibility to promote well-being to all of their employees to make sure that people can feel well and thrive in the workplace. And that can be through a range of initiatives, but that is about good mental health, good well-being. But then what you have to recognise is that you are going to have people in your organisation that are experiencing poor mental health and have mental health problems. And they need proper support and tailored support to enable them to stay in work and to be productive and to thrive, but they're going to need additional support needs because they have a mental health problem. And so you have to have that right support in place for those people.
Yeah.
But the third bucket is that there are absolutely fundamental drivers that are driving poor mental health in the workplace. And whether that be organisational cultures, whether that be, you know, line management relationships, whether that be long working hours, whether that be structural things in terms of the way that offices are designed. There are fundamental things that are driving poor mental health at work. So I think it's really important that you look at the whole spectrum. So absolutely, well-being for everybody. And we talk about, you know, what feel like the obvious things, you know, get breaks, eat well, get exercise. But they're obvious for a reason, because research and evidence shows that they have a positive impact on people's mental health. But through the employer lens, the employer absolutely has a role to make sure that they're tackling those drivers. And, you know, I always talk about health and safety. You were speaking about that earlier. We've spoken about health and safety for many years, but really all we've been speaking about is safety. We've never really been looking at the health element. And if you were in your office and a big hole appeared in the floor and one of your staff members fell down that hole and they broke their leg, you would do everything you could to make sure that another staff member did not fall down that hole and break their leg. And that should not be different to mental health. We should absolutely be putting in the things that keep people well in work. We all have a role to play in that, employers and employees.
Yeah, thanks, Faye. I can see Emma Casey make an important point in the chat about, there's, on the one hand, there's coping now with what's going on and often a different living environment and what have you, and then there's the impact on your mental health of worrying about what comes after, what comes next, and the uncertainties about that. Emma Casey, are you there? Emma Casey?
I am, yes.
Hello, Emma.
Hello, hi. Yeah, because I think there's sort of, in the moment, I'm finding it a highly stressful experience to be trying to be working in the same space as a child who wants some attention. And I think I deal with the compromises of being a working parent by, you know, packing. I go off to work, he goes off to school, I can't see him. And I think it's interesting to be in the same space and then having to make those choices all the time about what's getting your focus, which I'm finding quite stressful. But I think also the potential knock-ons to the future, I think lots of people have either lost their jobs or they're furloughed, they're worried about future prospects. And I think some of my colleagues are able to work potentially more productively and with less stress in the current environment. They're sitting in a room on their own with the door shut behind them, and they're being really super productive. And I think that I think there are a lot of us who are not able to be that productive at the moment, and the long-term effects of that are, it's difficult, but it's hard not to worry about that.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. I absolutely agree that there is an anxiety about being seen to be less effective because you have to just go and feed somebody a fish finger or mop their grazed knee or do any number of other things that children require of you, and they don't tend to work to a schedule on that. And I think that's real, and actually it's a good segue. I want to get into a conversation also here about inequality, because I think Richard's right in to say that this is a one-in-one conversation, but the scale of the impact and the likely damaging effect is not equal for everybody. That I think it's a mixed picture, and imagining working for a large organisation that has the resources and the intent to invest in this and to understand it and to do things to mitigate the damage is one thing, but not everybody has that kind of job or works in that kind of environment. And I want to go to Barbara Mariposa, who was actually came to a ThinkIn before Christmas on a similar topic to this. Obviously the world was normal before Christmas. There she is. Hi, Barbara. And you're are you a psychologist?
No, I'm a medical doctor.
Medical doctor.
Yeah, with a background in psychiatry, and I'm also what they call what's the word? An expert by experience, because I have experienced being unwell in a way that gets labelled as mental. And I think on your point of inequality, we know from past financial crises that we are in for a major wave, if you like, almost another epidemic of mental health problems, and that this will hit the lowest paid and least valued workers of our society in what we call the precariat. We have the data from previous financial crises, and these are also the people that get most stigmatized for having a problem. It's one thing to be, have a breakdown or whatever you like to call it if you're a CEO of a big company, or even have fixed employment with a workplace that's trying to take care of your well-being, but to be in a zero-hours contract or in part of this precariat, as we call it, we know that these diseases of despair, as they're called, another way of calling it, are going to escalate enormously. But I think that one of the opportunities that we have with this situation that we're all in is to really reshape the narrative around mental health and mental health problems. The thing that many of us, the people listening, I'm sure will be aware of, is that the narrative of the person having the problem is really one that is becoming quite outdated, and particularly now, because what we're seeing and what most of us are experiencing is what it's like to be in distress on the inside when we have a shared source of distress. And what we tend to do is unconsciously stigmatize people who have external sources of distress, for example, poverty, for example, structural bias, for example, victimization or bullying and harassment in the workplace, as if they had a problem. And we still talk about people in that way. They've got a mental health problem, when what we need to be doing is understanding it's like, if I can be this distressed or discombobulated by the rather privileged position of working from home, which is a privilege, how can this experience inform me of my understanding of people who are in distress in their inner worlds in ways that I can't see what that source of distress actually is and have no understanding about? And I think there's a conversation that we need to have on a much broader, wider level, so we can really start to get to grips with the social and political and economic forces that are shaping people's sense of self, which means whether they feel okay about themselves on the inside or not, and how they experience their distress.
Interesting. And in the biggest sense, I was interested in what Richard said, sort of an almost an offhand a sort of bio-lead comment about how the focus of Mental Health Week was going to be sleep, and you've shifted it to kindness.
Yes,
because actually that kindness thing goes very broad. This is a tiny example, and I probably shouldn't use it, but just before this ThinkIn, I live in rented accommodation, and the woman who is my landlady stopped outside the front and told me off that I hadn't watered the garden. And I felt absolutely awful. I felt just completely shaken by it. But I came inside and I sort of shook myself down, and then I thought to myself, well, look, everybody's just a bit weird at the moment, aren't they? So rather than getting all het up and cross about it, I just thought, everyone's gone weird and it's fine, and the next time I see her it'll be okay, rather than getting cross about it. And it's a tiny little thing, but just remembering to cut everybody a bit of slack is quite a good starting point.
It's exactly that. But I think that we need to expand that conversation to another level. I mean, a formative experience for me was when I was in Senegal. I was walking along the road with a friend who was Senegalese, and there was a guy coming towards us, and he had it was about 40 degrees centigrade. He had on 3 woolly hats with a pair of sunglasses over the top of his woolly hats, and he had a large boombox on his shoulder. And me with my sort of doctor brain went, oh, he's probably got schizophrenia or something. That was exactly how I categorized him immediately. And I said this to my Senegalese colleague, and he said, no, this person is actually a very valued member of society because he has experiences that none of us can actually share. So we make sure that he gets fed. And I was thinking, my gosh, that is just such a different approach. And we know from a lot of research that gets done around this, that the more compassionate the society is to other people's inner worlds as being different, the less suffering that person themselves experiences, and the less the need for them to be labelled in any way whatsoever.
Yeah. Thanks, Barbara. It's always nice to see you. Barbara's a regular at Tortoise ThinkIn in the chat. I'm going to come to Ben Lapin, or Lapin. I don't know how I say your surname, Ben. Your name caught my eye at the very, very beginning, because you said that you would under no circumstances talk to your employer if you were struggling with your mental health. And then you've gone on to make a series of excellent points since then. So I'd just like to hear a bit of a perspective from you on all this, Ben.
So yeah, possibly a bit of a keyboard warrior going in the chat and then getting pulled into this. So I think just the mental health question is one that I think is just going to keep getting tougher. So what Barbara was talking about, in terms of the circumstances of people's work becoming less secure and that kind of thing. And I think for knowledge economy workers, people always talk about the connection, sort of autonomy, mastery, the connection between effort and reward. Actually, we're working in structures that are in theory flatter, where decision making tends to be a lot more fragmented. There's sort of matrix organizations and all that kind of thing. And broadly, I feel like you kind of end up in a situation where if you don't feel in control of what's in front of you and the things that you're responsible for, then that ends up being quite jarring. And a lot of it then comes down to how you're perceived and that kind of thing in the organization, rather than necessarily kind of more tangible achievements. And I think the other thing about the knowledge economy world is something where you're often pushed to kind of have a passion for what you're doing, which I do have a passion for what I'm doing and I do enjoy it, and I'm very, very lucky. But when I used to work on building sites and things when I was younger, there was a real vibe of, right, if the sooner we get this done, the sooner we can get out of here, which you don't really have in an office. It's obviously the boundaries between home and work are less tangible, but there's also there's an attitude and a way that you're supposed to manage your emotions and your reaction and everything like that in an office that I find is just different to lots of the other more tangible work.
Yeah. I can see that there was also, funny enough, related to what you're saying, Ben, in the conversation we had about this before Christmas, we did talk a lot about work that has some sort of purpose or meaning, and how many people do things that they don't really feel has any purpose or meaning. If you feel like you're just producing endless PowerPoints, you go into some sort of weird existential crisis. I think that can have a significant impact on your mental health too, especially when you do it all of the time. Can I come to Tarek? You've had your hand up for a while, Tarek. Hello. Oh yes, cute baby. Excellent. We love a cute baby on a ThinkIn.
With the prop. I mean, I was interested in the CMO from BP's thoughts on the barriers of work breaking down. I've worked in quite a lot of different organizations, and it's a staple on some people to have a work persona. And when you've met them socially, that persona sort of does drop as a bit of a facade. So I think that can be a positive and negative thing, a sort of real double-edged sword. I was always, and it's a bit of an unreconstructed view, but one that I found helpful in circumstances, is when, if you're in a leadership position, you need to step back and create some sort of barrier, almost to be independent and make sure that the sort of any decisions you're making are independent of personal relationships with the team. It's also helpful if you're having to sort of engage in performance management and the things that such as that, and the persona can sort of empower that for good, for bad or worse. But that slipping away, seeing in people's houses, seeing people's children, and the noises they make, it does make everyone more human. But the underlying issues that people haven't gone away, and I think it's going to be really interesting how that unwinds. But I think positively, this has been a new experience for a lot of people. I lived in Mozambique for 2 or 3 years, and that was quite a formative period for me professionally and personally around just building resilience. And for a lot of people who've had to face their inner demons, their family demons, and come out the other side, I think it can be something that can prove to people that they have got the resilience there, and that's part of mental health as well.
Yes. Thanks, Rick. I'm going to come to Meronisa in a minute, but I'm conflicted about resilience in the same way I'm a bit conflicted about well-being in a work context, because when I worked in the big corporate world, which I did for a long time, I was encouraged to go on resilience training a lot, but made to climb that big pole and it'll make you a better marketing director, and partly because I just didn't like the idea of it and sulked about it, and partly because I was worried that the word resilience was used as a sort of euphemism for just keep going, we don't care. We don't care if you're struggling, we just expect for you to put up with it and crack on. And I think in the environment and the company that I was working in, it was quite a macho culture. It was all very, gung-ho and what have you. So I think resilience, when it's used in the right way, it's brilliant if we can invest in ourselves and develop a sort of an ability to sort of, but maybe the right kind of resilience is recognizing when you're struggling and being able to say, actually, I think I need to take a break, kind of thing.
Yeah, I was more around the sort of organic resilience we've all had to develop, and in Mozambique it was as simple as, water shortages, getting used to electricity shortages. Here it's, toilet paper shortages. So yeah, resilience in the sort of old-fashioned sense, or stoicism or something. But I understand the connotations. Essentially, when anything corporate touches something, it seems to sort of wither and die in terms of the original meaning. But just around, we've managed to adapt. We've got difficult situations we're going to come out of it. But yeah, I agree that some people, will need more support. Period.
Thanks so much, Tarek, and lovely to see you and your small person. Meronisa, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Today I'm having not very good day. I think I've been kind of doing really well, and then there were good days and bad days in this time. So,
so tell me what you do for a living, Meronisa. What's your job?
So I work at the University of London, and I work on helping develop distance learning programs. So you can imagine the work right now is off the scales. Yeah. But I was talking a little bit about some of the initiatives that our team has been doing. And one of the things that has been really wonderful is that our director generally is really great at creating space. And I think he's taken really well to online life. So we have a director at Meetup where we have optional quarantini. So you can bring your drinks along, and he really encourages everybody to turn their cameras on. And he's really casual, which I think creates a great environment. But a lot of it has been about how people are coping. And we've got an open chat communication in Teams where people put in crazy things like pictures of meadows that they're walking through, and like who's been baking what. And my own line manager for her smaller team has a weekend chill hour. So on Fridays we meet up for half an hour, and it's not a work meeting. It's just really sharing what works, what helps, what doesn't help. So it's not so much that they're assessing like your direct mental state. So I think it's a more nuanced way of doing a check-in where you're kind of talking about how are you coping, but not in a way that feels really invasive. And it was interesting because at the start of this week, she asked us, she said, I heard from one of the other teams that particular line manager has been doing a check-in every day. And we all sort of gasped and went like, oh my God, that's just not something that we like. So I think it's also trying a bit about creating a space where you can share your day-to-day worries, but it doesn't necessarily have to be from the point of view that you might be struggling with mental health. It's more like creating a positive environment for mental health, which I thought was actually really nice.
Yeah, really interesting. And so, funnily enough, thank you, Meronisa. Funny enough, one of the contributions in a conversation we had last week was from somebody who felt worried to articulate this point of view, to say, I know we're so lucky, and I know my employer's done so much to look after us and made tools and support sessions and everything available, but now I feel guilty that I'm not making use of them all the time because they just feel like more things to do. And I think that's another angle, isn't it? That there's sort of, if you start to think of, I must do the meditation and I must go to the hangout and I must do the, it starts to make you feel more anxious rather than less anxious.
Yeah, and actually it's a really good point that you said that, because it's purely optional for us. So one week I didn't turn up, but I know that there's other people who kind of, we come in, we either come in for 15 minutes or we don't come in at all, and there's no compulsion, which has been really unusual because I haven't had this before. Other workplaces that I've worked in, I mean, you just wouldn't have a conversation about mental health at all. So this is a huge leap forward. And there's also more generally, even at the town hall level, I think a lot more engagement with some of the issues that we're having. And I wonder whether it's also because we have a large student body. So we've done a lot of work around student mental health.
Yes.
And I think that's made staff mental health a little more front and center in the organisation.
Yeah. Thanks, Melis. That's brilliant. I'm going to come to Maud briefly, and then I'm going to come back to Richard because he's got the resilience chat is continuing, and I think Richard's got some good perspective on that. So let's go to Maud first, if we can. Maud Santa Maria, you made a point about gender balance. Hi, Maud.
Hi.
Just like my friend Abby. That's so funny. You came on the screen.
I am not Abby.
And your comment about the gender imbalance in the household particularly caught my eye.
Yeah, I think, I'm trying my best to be one of the women that says now I share the loads of everything and the chores, and then the child, I have a three-year-old one, so I'm definitely not inviting him on my lap right now. But then I saw Tarek having his baby, and I'm like, okay, maybe I shouldn't say this. I don't know if everybody feels the same, but I think it has been quite significant on my network that most women have said that they're definitely taking more of the chores than their partner. And I might be wrong. It'd be nice to have your thoughts as well, but it is something that I've seen a lot more.
Funny enough, there was a piece of research released, was it early this week or at the very end of last week, by the Fawcett Society and others, who had looked into the relative anxiety burden, if you like, since lockdown began, and found that women were reporting significantly higher levels of anxiety and disrupted sleep than men were. And I don't know if that's to do with where the burden of domestic chore work is falling, or if it's to do with the fact that women are disproportionately likely to be in less secure, low-paid employment, part-time jobs, or what have you. I'm sure it's a combination of things, but I do think there's a gendered aspect to this. Thanks, Maud. Nice to see you. Look, I'm going to come back to Richard Heron, if I can, because you wanted to pick up on the resilience point about resilience and focus.
Yeah, well, it's actually Tarek. You mentioned, once corporates touch things, they change and move, and I think that's a very, very sort of insightful point. If you try and measure well-being, actually, and people start tracking it, it moves because it's actually creating perverse incentives and things. When I talk about resilience, really the number one thing is this is not about helping people to, survive in a hotter kitchen. And if you think about resilience, even in an engineering sense, people talk about bounce back and stretch. Well, what the engineering model actually is that's when you take the heat away, it resumes its normal shape. So if you don't take the heat away, don't be surprised that it doesn't come back.
Yeah.
So I look at it in a different way. I think if you think about the skill, and whatever term you use, it will get, someone will abuse the term and then it'll affect it. But actually, it's really about helping people to focus on what's in front of them and deal with those intrusive thoughts, all those cognitive distortions. Is it, the catastrophizing, magnifying, personalizing things which get in the way of actually of certainty, and take us down all these blind alleys. So and really the way I sort of try and help people to hold this is, imagine you're with your partner and they're saying to you, you're not listening, are you? And you go, oh yes I am. What did I just say then? And you go, oh, I don't know, because you weren't listening. We're all human, and I've certainly had that conversation with my wife. But why is that? It's because I might be looking straight at you, but all these things are in my mind, and it's not the thing right in front of me. And if only I could put those away, I could develop that focus. And that's just so important in human relationships, whether it's at home or at work. So actually what we're trying to do is help people to be able to focus. And I think, again, when you look at things like headspace and meditation, they're trying to help people to focus. And when we're trying to help people to work in these environments where we've now got children on our knee or in the room or somewhere else, or the dog's walked in or whatever, it's also saying things like, mostly we can only concentrate for about 20 minutes and then we need a break. and actually coming back to it. So it's not so bad, actually, if you can get into that type of working. And, you know, psychologists have talked about Pomodoro working in the past. Your best half a day's work is 3 lots of 20 minutes, highly focused with a 10-minute break between each. And it's brilliant if you try it. You don't want to do it all the time, but just try it. If you can then sort of take those things into COVID, it just makes you feel much better about what you're trying to achieve in small slices of time with an everything else going on around me kind of world. And, you know, meditation isn't for everyone. So it's, you know, for other people, it's go and do the walk, get on a bike, just get away from what you are doing now and do something different. So I think it is about that. And I think it's also saying, you know, not everything about COVID is bad. Talking about presenteeism, what we're saying in COVID is do not come to work if you're sick. That's one of the critical components of this. We are not respectful of each other if we come in with a streaming cold now, because actually we might be infecting somebody with COVID when we come out of lockdown. So we can change the whole dynamic on being productive doesn't mean screwed to a desk or actually everything being measured all the time. Because if you're sick or if you're not quite well enough to be at home, at work, in a workplace, go somewhere else. And we have to find a way of dealing with that. So this is giving us some really interesting, I think, opportunities to deal with really big issues like presenteeism that we haven't dealt with very well before, you know, really sort of change the game on some of them.
Thanks, Richard. I'd like to come, if it's okay, to Naomi Mayer, who's put a comment in the chat that is worthy of listening to. Are you there, Naomi? Naomi Mayer, you okay? Come on. I can hear somebody tapping. Naomi Mayer, are you there? Perhaps not. I'll come instead to Chris. I don't know your surname, Chris. You're just coming up as Chris, but you've typed a couple of times about initially about things relating to climate change, and then just now about social justice. I'd like to hear from you if you're there, Chris. Mysterious surname.
Hello.
Hello. Oh, hi, Chris. Oh, yeah, I can see you. I've met you before.
Yeah, I guess I'm just connecting different thoughts around this. I work in the environmental sector, and I know a lot of other people that do. And sort of prior to COVID-19, we're already seeing a lot of kind of mental health challenges and impacts for people, particularly in that sector around climate change. Because it's something that feels quite ungraspable as a kind of phenomenon, and it, you know, particularly generative of things like anxiety and low-level depression and those kinds of things, or not just low-level, and how we manage that. And so I guess the question I raised earlier was, if there are these kind of adaptations in how large organizations work, do we need to be building into that some thinking ahead about climate and climate impacts, and how we include that? And I guess the sort of second point I made was, I noticed from the points that Barbara and Faye shared, that this conversation about mental health feels so fundamentally intersectional as well. So based on your race or your socioeconomic background, that totally defines your access to mental health support. It totally defines your exposure to COVID-19 as well, and those kinds of things. And so I guess it feels to me like the kind of culture change that we're cultivating within workplaces now, which is definitely a positive thing, about how that bridges to those that our companies work with, our organizations work with. How do we bridge that into wider societal change that maybe challenges some of those barriers to access to mental health support and mental health services as well? So I realize this may be a slightly different question, but I feel like those two things can be linked up in some way, or there's a bridging into that kind of almost a form of activism for mental health provision. You know, how do we promote the examples of best practice and share that knowledge?
Yes, I think it's a good point. I think there's something about strangeness of lockdown is the powerlessness of it, and yet knowing that there's all this looming stuff coming at us, even though inside this experience it's intense and it's difficult and it's lonely and it's frustrating and it's anxious making, we know there's worse to come, almost coming out the other side, and it's a frustration as to knowing how to knit all that stuff together, and trying to find ways to carve out useful, community facing, get outside myself, what can I do practically to help. I might come back to Faye on that if I can, in terms of specific and practical things that we might do, not so much to manage our own mental health now, because those sorts of tips and tricks are easy to find, and we know them, but more about how we might look to sort of craft, I mean, Chris's word was activism for mental health provision, whether we choose that word or not. You see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I mean, the roots of Mind as a charity is active. That's exactly what we were designed to do. It was to be activists. And I think, my area is specifically around workplace wellbeing, but at Mind, we have a whole network of local minds and a whole policy and campaigns team that is all around kind of getting out there and trying to really shift policies, law, cultures, behaviours that are really impacting those in most need around their mental health. And I think that we have to think about that at a kind of community level. And then when we take that down to the workplace, we have to think about all of the different audiences that we're talking about in the workplace. So at Mind, we've been currently thinking about audiences in a slightly different way in the workplace setting. So we've got people that are still working and they're being paid, but they're basically working in a completely different environment, working from home all of the time. We've got people who are not working, so they've either been furloughed, they've been made redundant, people are losing their businesses, so that whole group of people. We've got people who are working on the front line, so our emergency services workers, our NHS, our social care workers, and then we've got our key workers, who are other people that are going into their jobs and trying to keep the country running but putting themselves at risk. So you break it up into those audiences, and then within those audiences, you have a whole range of demographics. So it's a huge piece. But I think from an organisational level, you have to think about all of those different audiences and all of the things that are going to impact on those different audiences. And I think coming back to something Richard said earlier, you can only know the impact on those audiences if you have a conversation with them. You can't just assume to know what those are. You have to have those conversations. So for me, there is a bit of a starting point at the moment that we need to be having conversations with these different groups to really understand the impact of COVID-19 on them before we start deciding what we need to do to go out and sort of help. And I think, we're currently doing a rolling survey at Mind around mental health and coronavirus, and we've spoken to over 13,000 people so far. And what we're seeing is 2/3 of people have said that their mental health has got worse, but that is higher in the BAME community, it's higher for people with long-term conditions, it's higher for people in social housing, and it's higher for people whose employment status have changed. So we can already start to see that some of those health inequalities that were already there are really coming to the forefront as a result of COVID-19. So for me, the first part is have the conversation, understand the impact, don't just assume that we know. From there, I think we can start to really build up our campaigning and think about actually what we can do to really shift some of those inequalities.
Yeah, it does feel to me with this mental health thing and the relationships people have with their employers, for the most part, at least the people that we've come across, that at least the conversation isn't going to go away when the lockdown starts to ease, even though not everybody has had a wonderful experience. It doesn't feel like it's going to recede. We had ThinkIn week before last with a guy called Mo, whose only name on screen was Mo the bus driver, who works for one of the transport providers in London. And obviously, and he was reporting, really high levels of anxiety amongst him and his colleagues, but their immediate focus was their physical health. So they were sort of dealing with a mental health downstream impact from his sort of line managers not taking their physical safety seriously enough. And it certainly felt like, from his, I'm sort of speaking for him, that something had shifted in the way that he and his colleagues, other bus drivers, and actually the people who cleaned the buses, were communicating with one another, and how that communication was then relating to the management team that wouldn't go away anytime soon. It was a catalyst for a different nature of conversation. I might just go to John Crowley, who's made a couple of comments in the chat and asking for sort of practical examples. Hi, John.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi. Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, so I think there's a culture that's forced on us at home where when we're working from home, to be constantly kind of on all the time. And it's kind of, unfortunately, it comes from just looking at the internet, seeing everyone kind of baking their sourdough, or learning to jog, or writing the great novel of the 21st century. And I think, just someone was saying earlier, that we need to be kind to ourselves, and that, you know, by switching off at some points and having downtime, that allows us to be more creative at other times. And I don't know if other people felt that urge just to keep on going and going, where you end up just feeling just incredibly burnt out. And the other point I wanted to ask was to hear from other people where perhaps, you know, they've got some positive moves from employees where and there's a little bit in the chat there just at the end while I was exchanging messages of employees who are perhaps more enlightened than others, and who are thinking of their staff. Yeah.
Thank you, John. I think there's lots of different things that have been put in place, and I think it depends also a lot about the size of your organisation, the nature of your team, the nature of the work that you do. One of the pressure points that I've heard a few times in other conversations, where perhaps you're working in a team, and maybe you're the boss of that team, or maybe you're not the boss of that team, but if you're the only one that has kids at home and everybody else doesn't, that's another thing to be wary of. That how do you explain and show without looking like you're, there's lots of, I think what would be so simple and brilliant is a one size fits all. This is the way to manage a working day if you're at home and you're not normally, but of course there just is no such thing. And so organizations, big and small, are having to be very flexible and plastic, which perhaps they don't normally have to be that way. And that's difficult for managers and employees alike. I mean, in Tortoise, we're a tiny organization, but one of our co-founders, goes dart for 2 hours a day because he's homeschooling the kids. And whilst that's not desperately fun for him, I don't think, it certainly sends a message to the rest of us that if we do need to go out and water the garden because the landlady's just told us off, then it's okay to do that, which helps a lot. We've only got 3 minutes left, or 2.5 minutes left. I'm going to go to Michelle Spirit, because she's got a couple of a checklist. I do like a checklist. Hi, Michelle.
Hi there. Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
I like your checklist.
Yes, I came across that yesterday actually, and everyone immediately thought, fantastic. It's so simple. It provides a really good structure for people to not get that impression that a huge amount is expected of them. Because what we know is that people are working far more hours actually, but not constructively than they were before, to almost overcompensate.
Yeah.
So this is some kind of framework, and if you can combine it with supervision, even better, which helps them recognise exactly what is expected of them. So even if they just do that one activity, that priority, there's that sense of control. I've done something fantastic, rather than sort of waking up and being a bit, confused about what you're going to do that day, particularly if you've got kids working from home. Yeah. I think they say you shouldn't say I'm working from home. You should say I'm at home trying to work.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're into the last minute. I might just come briefly back to Richard just for a sort of a last word, maybe a tip or a piece of advice or something before we all tootle off.
I think 2 quick points. I think what I'm trying to move our organisation is from caring for, which is this kind of after the fact support, to caring about people enough to prevent things. So that, I think it's a really important distinction, which gives people that control that they don't have enough of. And leading with care in mind. If employers are leading with care in mind, I think really it's trying to help realise that that's actually going to help them to be commercially successful as well. I think as we come out of COVID, people are looking how you responded in your community. How did people help out in that? What was your responsibility to your employers, and how did you discharge that? So I think the kind of, whether it's a winners and losers thing, which actually is appealing to leaders in organizations, we have the opportunity to demonstrate that care is actually an important part of being successful, and we can help them to change that, which will be of benefit to many, many people. So I think that's the big thing. Can we actually start marketing care as a business imperative? You know, really, can we do that? Customers are looking for it, the public are looking for it, and employees are certainly looking for it wherever they work.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent note on which to end, Richard, to be able to sort of position the caring, kind mode of business as a commercial driver rather than a sort of side option, but something that the learning and development team have to think about once a year is certainly a good place to shoot for. Thank you so much to everybody who's joined the conversation. There's a few things that I will take away with me. £45 billion a year, 29 billion of which, this is before COVID, is down to presenteeism, are some really big numbers that we all sort of have a duty, having now known them, to be mindful of and do our little bit to try and not be part of contributing to that presenteeism statistic. I think the 1-in-1, I know it's a soundbite, but I think it's a true one that Richard used at the beginning, is something that is worth remembering, not just for now, but for the long term. I was really interested in what Chris was getting at, which is trying to sort of wire together the long-term challenges that humanity was facing anyway, in climate and now in global health, with this sort of what's going on inside our inner lives. That point that Barbara was making, I think, is interesting. It's a difficult thing to kind of frame, but I think that's part of an interesting, perhaps, sort of shift of perspective from inside myself to sort of out and in the community, and how that might affect everything. Have a lovely afternoon. I recommend everybody now doesn't go immediately on another Zoom call, but goes to the kitchen, makes himself a cup of tea, has a sandwich, goes out, sees a bird, sees a tree. Just have a bit of a breather for 20 minutes before you go and do another one of these. I'm back this evening at 6:30 talking to the very fabulous Stuart McConey about his brilliant new book, The Nanny State Made Me, and if you fancy it, come along. And in the meantime, I'll give you all a cheery wave. Ta-ta!